Hello, everybody. Okay. So the last three lectures were focused on design elements, and I talked about the idea that there's kind of levels when it comes to making products. At the lowest level, you're really just copying things that you see and making some slight changes to them. You go a bit higher than that, you'll largely do what you're told, which may involve you doing things which you haven't encountered before or you're trying things out. But to get to the highest level of quality in what you make, you don't want to be dependent on your manager or whatever being wise, being capable. At the highest level, you need to understand what your customer wants. So your customer is the person who's paying for whatever work's being done, and what your end user wants. So that's the person who's going to be using whatever you make. And the great products are basically about repeated polish and refinement to suit that person and to suit that person's mind. And I gave you the example of the computer game example where a very, very subtle refinement in the way the numbers worked in terms of controlling something in the game led to this amazing effect where your brain sort of is comfortable enough with the interface with something that it sort of ignores that you're interacting through an interface. And it starts to feel like it's a real thing. Without having actually experienced that yourself, it's hard to appreciate what a dramatic difference that represents. But generally speaking, user interfaces which are very, very bad are ones that do the opposite of what your internal model thinks. And your user interfaces that are amazingly good, that are sort of a joy to use, are ones that have been polished so much that you've got that level of interactivity. Again, that level of quality is beyond what most commercial companies manage to achieve. But I think it's important for you to know what the top level actually is. In order to actually achieve that, what you need to do is, as much as possible, steal from other people. You need to look at existing products, learn as much as you can from them, and generally take the best that exists in the industry as much as you possibly can. And the only time you shouldn't be doing that is that all of your products should it be in some way original. And I mentioned one way in which you can generate original products, and that is to find what all of your products have in common, or what they have never even contemplated removing. And remove that, or reverse that, and imagine what it used to be like. So one of the design exercises, I got sent a lot of training courses over the years, and one of them was for design and natural thinking. And I quite enjoyed that. One of the tasks we had to do, we would walk outside the building, go around this shopping area, and look at things, pick a product, reverse an essential feature from it, and then try to create a new product out of reversing it. So the one that we came across was a watch, and it said, what if it was a watch that didn't tell the time? And so the idea that we came up with was, what if it was a watch that told you the time to your next appointment? Because that's mostly what you look, well, depending on your life, that's mostly what you're looking at when you look at your watch. So we came up with a different way in which this incredibly common device was present. Now, it may or may not be a big discovery or a big invention, but that sort of thing is an original contribution. And it's an original contribution because all the other people who've been working in that area, it's probably never occurred to them to try and remove one of the things they consider to be essential about the product. So that's one way in which you can come up with original or lateral ideas. So if you want to make a really good product, you largely copy the best that exists, which means you have to go onto the web, you have to look at these products. I know for some of you that might be quite intimidating because you're just learning how to make products. Initially, you're learning how to program, and the thought of having to compete with some commercial product is quite intimidating. So some of you may be drawn to redefine your projects and simplify them into something that you immediately know how to make. I discourage you from doing that because it will make it much more difficult for you to get the higher marks in the course. So largely, you're building on what already exists, and professional designers, professional artists, people in creative industries spend a huge amount of time researching existing products to build on top of them and to make use of them. So the idea that you are original because you don't touch any other influence is almost a complete lie, right? Generally speaking, anyone who's creative, they have absorbed a massive amount of existing stuff, and they need to have done that in a way in order to identify the things that are new contributions, okay? So for the design lab tomorrow, and it will take you the rest of the week to work on that in your teams, really go and find products, really try to learn from them. It doesn't matter if some of the things that you learn from them, some of the things you'd like to put into your product, you can't, and you don't manage to by the end of it. The process of trying and doing it for real is important. Okay. And then when it comes to your distinctive thing, if you are actually building on the best that exists, the reason that they're so good is because they've been refined and polished over the years. So any new thing you introduce will automatically be worse than what already exists, almost always. And it will require a lot of polish to actually get it to the same standard. So that's something to bear in mind, and that's why you don't put in loads of features. You put in a small number of original things and try to replicate the key things that other people have produced, and you try to raise the standard as high as you can with a small number of things. Okay, that's the best quality product you can make. Okay, so that's enough about that. I can go through some of the things with usability, but I'm going to move on from that now. Okay, just a few things. So the first thing to note at the lab tomorrow, I've made a slight change to task 2, I think it is, because there were some issues last year with people not getting it. So when you're completing the lab, the first thing to note is you'll get links on the lab saying add a feature or add an inspirational product or something like that. Those links are just redirecting you to the same links that you could go to from the main dashboard of the web app. Okay, so you're now starting to contribute to the group project. And everything you submit, your peers in your team will also be able to see. Okay? The second task asks you to find an inspirational product, so really find a credible product and really try to learn from that. You're asked to include one essential feature and one nice-to-have feature from that product. Okay? Now, they all have to relate to the same inspirational product. Otherwise, the submit button won't appear. So you get a little bit more feedback saying what you have to do this time. Okay, so that was one of the main issues people had last year. Another thing that happened last year was some people felt that they had submitted the lab because they had added to the group project. That's not true. You actually have to go through the lab link and click submit to do a lab submission. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. And you won't be able to submit the lab if you haven't added the elements to the group project that you need to. Okay. So that's all of that. So now we're going to talk briefly about a bit about Bootstrap, and then I'm going to do some live programming today and on Friday as well. So the programming that we're doing is preparation not for the lab tomorrow, but for the lab after that. Many people found the step up to this level of programming, this level of development, quite difficult last year. Okay, so I'm going to run through the code in lectures. I'll include an example of the source code that I'm showing you today and on Friday on the resources website as well. And ideally, I'll also upload a video, but I can't guarantee that it works out okay. But the intention is to upload a video. And just bear in mind that you will need to, it requires quite a bit more engagement to be able to do the next lab than the previous ones. Okay? So with the previous ones, you could largely, Google stuff and go to W3 Schools. This time we're going to be using the features of the web server, so that it's not something you can just Google and copy stuff and kind of wing it. You do actually have to be able to understand this. So this is usually the transitionary point at which people start asking for more direct help, and please do that. Please come and talk to me if things aren't clear. So just expect that to be the case. Okay, so first of all, why are we using Bootstrap? What's Bootstrap for? Well, the web is a fascinating kind of platform, which is quite unlike other ones. So, obviously in the games industry, we work on things like different consoles, or you can work on a Mac or a PC, different platforms like this. But generally speaking, most platforms in which you make things, they are entirely controlled by a single organization. And the web isn't like that. There's a standards body, and then there's a set of companies and non-profits that make web browsers. And there's some kind of negotiation between these different groups. Can you hear me? All right, just give me a sec. Okay, so the web is kind of anarchic in a way that very few technical platforms are. So what this actually means is that if you're making websites to a high standard, or you're introducing features for them, one of the things that you will encounter is things that particularly Microsoft were particularly evil for this. They wouldn't follow the standards. And so positioning things in a consistent way on a page is very difficult to do. And what has happened is, because the internet is a community, software has been built on top of this very, very messy foundation to make interacting with the web more stable. Okay? So various tools have been created, sort of complex workarounds that wouldn't normally exist on other platforms, but are necessary to deal with the fact that all of the browsers interpret things in different ways. So for JavaScript, for example, you have something called jQuery, which we won't go into in detail in this course, but if you go to the W3 Schools website, there's a whole guide for dealing with jQuery. And jQuery is just a way of making JavaScript a bit easier to use, and again, creating a consistent interface across all the different browsers. What we will be using is Bootstrap. So Bootstrap instead, it provides a consistent way for displaying and positioning things on the screen, and slightly more polished version with default HTML. Okay. The other problem is that the browsers keep changing. They're not really cooperating with each other, and to some extent they're competing with each other. So they often introduce features in quite an antagonistic way. Things like video playback is a nightmare on the internet because they just refuse to settle on a single file format. So a lot of these things, you end up using some form of library to wrap and make it more accessible. The other thing that's very important is, particularly for almost any product you make, but especially for a product which isn't, say, an internal corporate product, you don't want to throw away users. So if users are on a particular platform, in particular if they're on mobile, you don't want to throw them away because of the technical difficulties of supporting them, and that's one of the reasons why Bootstrap is so helpful. Okay, so it's quite a challenge to create a website that is readable and interactable on something as small as a little handheld phone and still looks sensible on a really big screen. So I encourage you to start with relatively simple designs and to test them as much as you can. Okay, so this is just repeating what I said before about in terms of a community. Okay, so the last thing that you will have to do for tomorrow's lab is to create use cases. So if you remember from the previous lectures, use cases are realistic stories of your fictional end user's interaction with the product. It should be focused on what their concerns are, what their interests are, what they're trying to find out. It consists of a sequence of steps, small, simple steps, with each step representing some feature or a page associated with your product. So once you have a use case, the first thing that you need to do, and what you need to do to complete the labs, is to create a static page. Okay? And I showed you an example last time, which we'll go through, continue to go through, the sort of news website. So this alternative take on things like BBC News or Slashdot or that sort of thing. And that's what we'll continue with today. But what I would encourage you to do always whenever you're mocking these things up is to just copy from somebody else. So copy from another website, see if you can mock something up that looks similar, and only change things when they relate to what you're doing that is distinctive and original about your product. Okay? Because really what you're doing when you're copying is ideally you are learning from their experiences. And that's why it's particularly valuable to do that. Okay, so the first thing you should be doing, let me get this running. Okay, right, so the last thing that you would be doing in the labs tomorrow is you'd be adding a page. Okay, so if you want to do the front page of your website, then you want to call it index. Okay, so that's the page that the web server will go to if nobody types anything in. Just call it index, and you can put in a bit of description, but we're just going to do this very quickly. Okay, so that's all that's required of you for tomorrow's lab, is that you just name a bunch of pages and you go to the use case and you link back to these pages in your use case. Okay, so every time you add something like that, to check that everything is working and your teammates haven't broken everything, you click on the project overview link off the dashboard. Hopefully the Wi-Fi will stand up to this. Okay, and at the bottom of this link, which clearly the Wi-Fi has died, there will be a big link, and when you click on that, you will download a zip, just like you have for the first two labs. Okay, and so if you take that zip and you, sorry, here we go. You take that zip and you create a project out of it. It will look very similar to the ones you did with the previous labs. Okay, so you've got a main. Now, if you happen to have created any pages, then either if they are HTML pages, they will appear here. So I was a little bit quick there. When I created the page, you actually have to do one more step. But as the Wi-Fi is not working, it's not working very well. So once you created the page, you then have to explicitly say whether you want to make a static page or a dynamic page. In this case, you want to make a static page. So when you make that static page, the page will appear here. So whatever you happen to call it, .html, will appear in your HTTP docs directory. So if you then run this,
Okay. That's all running. If I refresh this. Yeah. Okay. It'll look like this, right? As simple a page as you can possibly get, just with a heading. So, not for tomorrow, but for Tuesday after that, the next thing that you need to do is load up Pingendu and make a more interesting looking page. Okay? And use the Bootstrap features of Pingendu to drag and drop some stuff. So let's see what I've got here. Show you an example. Okay. And okay. And you can just drag and drop some stuff. So you can drag whole templated stuff. Again, because you don't have the internet connection, this won't appear very well. But if you just drag stuff from the sections section, you can very quickly make an interesting looking page. You can stick a footer at the bottom, which will have a load of sort of icons for different things. Again, this looks kind of crap because it's not connected to the internet properly. But you knock something up, and then you can use the layout features of Bootstrap, which consists of different columns and rows. And I encourage you to go to W3 Schools, click on the Bootstrap link, and look in more detail at the different types of tools you can use with Bootstrap. Okay. Right, so you do that, you make those changes, sorry, then you bring up your HTML, copy the HTML, sorry, there we go, copy the HTML, go back to your web app, we can find which one it is, which of course isn't loading, but we can fix that. Okay, just give me a sec. Okay, there we go. So you go back to your Pages tab, and again, just repeat what I did before. You won't have to create this. This is just because I'm loading this locally rather than over the network. Okay, so down at the bottom we have the index page, and we previously should have done that to turn it into a static page. Okay, so now we copy in the changes that we've made in Pingendu to do the layout onto this thing, to do update static page, and click update static page, right? Now, whenever anyone, including yourself, grabs the group project via the project overview here, those HTML pages will have been updated. Okay, so let's check that. Here's one I made earlier version. Okay. So hopefully all of that sort of makes sense, and you should have seen that once before. Just to make absolutely sure I'm running the right one, I'll do that. Okey-doke. Okay, so now when you refresh localhost, you get a more interesting page. So here's the page I made earlier. Now, the page that I was trying to create here is just the front page. Now, previously I talked about the front page having multiple articles on the front page. So the design has moved on a little bit, and we've got two types of things for this product. So this product has the idea that there are news events that occur, in this case Donald Trump's inauguration, And then there are different newspapers that have talked about this product in different ways. Okay? So eventually, we want users to be able to create news events and to be able to create articles and link those articles to the news events. So you start by just mocking something up like this. And there's a bunch of information that I've put in just rather randomly, types of information that we might want to store about a particular news article. So how left-wing or right-wing it is, a link to the article, link to journalists, so you may be cross-referenced by journalists. Later on, you might be able to search by journalists. Date it was published, so you can look at a timeline maybe later on. All these kinds of features you can imagine. And you're just sticking stuff in a very rough way that represents those features that you might want in the future. Okay? And that'll get you through the first task, right? So the next thing we want to do is we want to start to turn this static mock-up into something that's actually generated from code. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, the next thing we do, I stop that, and then I start this. So we go back to the web app. Right. Okay, we go back to pages. We go to the page, our front page that we were creating there, which is the index one. Now obviously only one person can make an index page, the other ones will have to make other pages. And we can click turn into dynamic page, okay? So that will automatically do the stuff that you did in the first lab, I think it was, where you were converting a static web page and putting escape characters in to make it appear. By doing that click, whenever you grab the zip for the project, it will look a bit like this. Let me zoom in. Okay, so instead, now in HTTP docs directory, you'll see there's no index.html anymore. That's gone, and instead there is index.java in the views folder. And if we look at that, what does it look like? It's got all this string to send to web browser lines in that you should be familiar to you. Okay, and it's just embedded all that HTML there for you. Okay. So you should download that, check it runs, check everything's okay, check your teammates haven't broken the project, that kind of thing. And then the next task is to say, okay, what we want to do is we want to make a step towards the website that we mocked up, which is here, actually coming from a database. So the first thing we want to do is we want to say, okay, well, what would the database have to store in order for that page to be the result of it? Okay, so we've got two different things here, at least. We've got news events and we have news stories. So what you need to do then is go back to the web app and say, okay, we want to make some models that represent these things. Now, I just want to try and remind myself what I called them. Yeah, news event and news story. Okay. So it's as simple as that, right? So you call news events, suggest a new model, news story, next new model. Okay, so another thing to warn you about. So last year, a few people called their stuff news event and news story when they were doing things that had nothing to do with news. Okay? So there's nothing magical about these names. These are just Java class names. You can call them whatever you want. Try to call variables things that make sense for your object. Okay? So by clicking on these things, what's happened is that whenever you download the zip for the project, you will now find that you'll have these extra classes in the model folder. So these are classes that you're going to store information on the server with. Okay? Yours might look slightly different. It'll say implement serializable rather than extend smart serializable. That's just a thing from last year. So the next thing that you need to do is you need to think about, for each of these things that we're going to be storing on the database, what information do they need to contain? Okay? So what is associated with the news event? So for this website, we might have everything we want to have a unique ID. So we need a way of referring to this thing a bit like a pointer. We need to give it a unique name of some description. That's not necessarily something you print. Later on, I'll show you how you can generate a unique ID with a timestamp. But it's just a unique ID for it. So in this case, we're going to have, say, a picture of some kind. That's probably going to be a URL, actually, rather than a file path. A title that appears, a description. And then here we have an array list. Okay? So we have more than one. Story. Okay, so more than one. The whole point of this website is to look at the different people who have different news sites, news journalists who've written about the same issue and potentially described it in totally different ways. So if we want to have multiple things about another thing, then we typically want an array list. Okay, and for most of you, you will be making things that are like this. So if you have an article and you have also comments, then the comments will probably be an array list as well. So the next thing to note is this is an array list of strings. So it's not an array list of objects, because all you're doing, and I'll talk about this later on Friday, is you're just pointing to those stories in this case. And the way you point at things with this database is you point at things using their unique ID, which is a string. But for the time being, understand that this is one way of doing this, and I'll show you how it works in a moment. So the point is that you think about all the things you want to store. If you want to store references to other things, use their unique ID rather than having them in place. If you have more than one, then you want an array list. And then a story looks kind of similar. A title, date it was published. In this case, I'm using a long. A long is what's returned if you ask Java to give you a timestamp. And you can turn that into a visible date later on if you want to. Or you could store that as a string if you prefer. Various other different things. And again, we're using strings to refer to other things, like a newspaper. So that would be like an ID for a newspaper. That would be a list of journalists and things like this. Number of left votes, number of right votes, that kind of thing. Okay, so you add these members to the object, and then you select all the code, and you go back to your group page, you go to your models, and you update the appropriate model. Okay. Make sure that your code compiles, because you just click update. Right, if your code doesn't compile locally and you upload code with compile errors in it, then all the peers on your team, when they download their zip, it won't work. So make sure, if you're unsure about this, then submit things through the labs or with other team members so they can check your work. That's why it's vitally important you work in teams. Some of you will have had experience using source control, things like GitHub and SourceForge and various things like this. That's absolutely fine. If you have experience with this, you can use that as the way of managing your project. The thing you have to bear in mind is you still need to submit stuff through the web app to complete the labs, and you need to submit stuff so that you get credit for the work that you've done. So if you want to manage the project in parallel and just submit through this on lab days, that's absolutely fine. But just make sure it's not one person who does all the submissions and they're the only person who will get credit for the work. So just be careful about that, okay? Right, so when you grab this now as a zip, it should be exactly as you updated it. Everything should be fine. So the next thing that you need to do is you're going to change this dynamic page. Previously, the dynamic page looked like this, okay? So previously, it was just a big string that was being added to a bit at a time. Now what we want to do is we actually want to construct the HTML of the page using something that eventually will come from the database. But initially, just for the not tomorrow's lab, but the lab after that, you're just going to make one in place. Okay? So this is like a debug object. For the lab after that one, you're actually going to save it to the database and retrieve it from a database, but for the not tomorrow's, but next Tuesday's, you're just going to make a fake one as if you got it from the database. So you make a fake one and you stick some stuff in it. So you can see there news event.stories.add. That's just how you add to an array list. Okay, that's adding elements to an array list. Okay, and just for testing purposes, I've just added the same one twice. Okay. Now, this is why you need to understand the HTML that you create. Because you need to go down the HTML until you get to the bit which was where you put the title. So if I have a look at the previous one, I can show you. So in the previous one, if I can find it here, there we go. There was a panel that was created which had a heading which was the event, Donald Trump inauguration. Okay. So that code has now been changed in the new version. So in the new version, it's taking that information from this object. Okay, so this whole page is about a particular news event, and now the title and the description are coming from that place. So on the page as well then, there was an example underneath it. So if I bring up the page, you can see. Okay, right? So, sorry, yeah, so this is the bit that we were just looking at. This is the Donald Trump inauguration. So this is the information from the news event object. And then we have this sort of panel here. And this panel is associated with a particular newspaper article. Okay, so that's a news story. Let's go back to the code. So what you have to do there is find the code associated with the panel. Okay, so there's the bit that was the heading, right? That's the bit that we just saw changed. And this whole section here is making that panel appear. I think it's this bit actually. Okay, so that little blue topped panel is all of this. So again, we want to change that so that it's coming from code. Now, we assumed that there were multiple stories. So the way you go through an array list of entries is you can do it like this with a for loop. So every time there is a new ID here, it's going to run this code. And this will give you the element in the array list. So this is just the next ID. And we're going to do the same thing we did before. So if this was the real version using the database, we would then take this ID and we would look up in the database about that news story. And we would get the news story back from the database. But because we're not quite ready for the database yet, we're just going to make a fake one and give it a fake title. And then we're going to use that information to make the panel here. Okay, very similar to the previous one. We just take the text that was there and replace it with information from the database. Okay, so this is what a dynamic page looks like. There's a lot of template HTML in place, and then the parts that are being modified from the information you stored in the database are being changed through this. Okay. So let's look at what that's like when we run it. And you would go through exactly the same steps. You would make those changes in the code. You'd run the web server as we are here to make sure everything works and looks as we expect it to. So that's what the old version used to look like. Assuming I've got this running quickly. Yeah, okay. So what you'll see here is it's slightly different. And the reason it's slightly different is because I used a slightly different text in the example, in the hard-coded example in the code, okay? But the heading now is not coming from a string, it's coming from an object. And because we use 2 examples of stories, we get the thing repeated twice. Okay? Now, something which I'm not going to go through now, but I will go through on Friday, is to fully complete the lab. Ultimately, you need to add a form as well. But we'll talk about that bit on Friday. Okay? So, like I said before, this is quite a bit more involved than the previous ones. So assume that you're going to have to spend a bit of time getting to grips with this. All the code that I've just shown you here, I'm going to upload. So you'll see a set of folders. Each folder corresponds to a different project that I've shown you one after another. It corresponds to the steps that you'll need to go through in order to do that. Yeah, and please come and ask questions and talk to me, and expect this to be a challenge for many of you to get that level. Now, having said that it's a challenge, something to bear in mind is that once you have managed to get to grips with this, and the next lab, which is the lab about saving and retrieving from the database, you will have all the programming tools you need to make dynamic web pages. Okay? Which is an incredibly powerful capability to have. Okay, so let's just return to the presentation. Okay, so the slides as well can be useful. I know that some of you will be uncomfortable with things like array lists. So I really encourage you to go through some of these links, which will explain them in more detail to you. They're really important to implement some of the more advanced features in the course. Okay? Thank you very much. That's it.